Hi, this is Elder Vicki Baker reading another fully transcribed sermon from Pastor Shane Vaughn, who is the founder of First Harvest Ministries. He has over 2,000 preserved teachings, and they can all be found at hiscomingkingdom.com. Let's begin the remarriage, revisited. The truth is going to set you free. Let's begin. From the beginning, it was not so. A fresh look at marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Hello, and welcome to a teaching that I believe will make a vast difference in your life and the life of your loved ones. I truly believe that it's a teaching whose time has come to help so many people that are torn apart by the ravages of divorce and possible remarriage. Divorce is painful enough, and remarriage is difficult enough. But when you throw in the nuance of the church and our teachings we have always held concerning divorce and remarriage, it sure doesn't help the struggle that maybe you have had to go through. If you are watching this teaching, you are one of three groups of people. You are someone who believes in divorce and remarriage, or you're someone who doesn't believe in divorce and remarriage, or you're someone who has no idea. This lesson is going to help you settle this issue forever. Jesus, Yeshua, tells us concerning divorce and remarriage that from the beginning, it was not so. This is the title of this lesson today. From the beginning, it was not so. We talked divorce and remarriage previously in our church and in our local congregation. And that video is available on our channel. Let's talk about the subject of divorce and remarriage and Jesus' words from the beginning, it was not so. Going forward, I will refer to Jesus by his original Hebrew name, the name that his mother called him, the name that the angels called him, and that is Yeshua. That way, you are not confused when you hear me referring to him by that name. God created a perfect world. In the beginning, everything was perfect. There was no murder. There was no theft. There was no rebellion. There was no divorce in the beginning. So Jesus was right. Yeshua was correct when he talked about divorce in the book of Matthew, chapter 5, saying it was not so. But he could have said the same thing about murder. He could have said the same thing about theft. He could have said the same thing about rebellion, and it would have all been true. But it doesn't mean that it would have been a reality of the world that we are living in. Truthfully, even though these things were not from the beginning, does not mean they are not now. Men's hearts are rebellious, and they were inclined toward rebellion from the very beginning of time. There was no murder. So once murder began to creep up into society, there had to be a law enacted that would bring punishment for murder. That law comes forth from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. When God gave laws to Moses for the nations of Israel, the penalty for murder was death. There was another punishment enacted for thievery or theft. If you stole something, it had to be repaid 2 times the amount that you stole. They didn't just lock you up and throw away the key. They made you repay twice what you stole. For rebellion or rebellious children, the punishment was stoning. They would take you and stone you to teach you not to be rebellious. If a marriage was ended or dissolved, there was a punishment for that. The punishment was called divorce. The truth is, brothers and sisters, divorce is the punishment for a less than perfect marriage. For a marriage that cannot find a way forward, it is a punishment for 2 people who cannot rise to the level of working it out. There is a punishment for it. And that punishment is called divorce. Now, Listen to me carefully. Punishment is not the end. Punishment is to give you a new beginning. When you were a child and you were punished for something, there was almost a relief in the punishment. Why? Because the slate was clean. You could start over, but you had to endure the punishment. I don't know of anyone who has gone through the pains of divorce who would not rightly describe it as punishment. Maybe it's punishment for selfishness. It is punishment for whatever it was that caused the marriage to become unworkable. Whatever would cause that marriage to not be salvaged. Because maybe one person was not willing to salvage it. It brings both people into a punishment. And that punishment is called divorce. I want to say this from the beginning of this lesson. God, whom I will refer to from here on out by his Hebrew name, Yahweh, hates divorce. He absolutely despises divorce. If you watch the teaching to the very end, you will be rewarded with great knowledge and understanding. However, when I get to the end, I never want it said that I am promoting divorce or even giving it any kind of stamp of approval. It's horrible. It's painful. I know from experience that there is nothing like it in the world, especially if your children are involved. It is indeed a punishment. Yahweh hates divorce, but it's not the divorce that Yahweh hates, not the act of divorce, because divorce is the punishment. So it is not the punishment that Yahweh hates, it's what led to the punishment. It's the unfaithfulness, or whatever it was that broke up the marriage that led to divorce. That's what Yahweh hates. The results or the consequences of our choices. Do you know why Yahweh hates divorce? Because he loves covenant. I want to keep that word covenant in your mind. When I use the word covenant, I want you to truly grasp what a covenant is. A covenant is an agreement between two or more parties. A covenant is a handshake with a promise. A covenant is if I tell you, if you paint my home, you will get $1,000 in return, and we shake hands on it or sign an agreement, and we have entered into a covenant. Yahweh is a covenant-keeping God. So why does he hate divorce? Not because of divorce itself, but because a covenant was broken. Anytime we do not honor covenants, it places society in a very bad situation. Indeed, this generation that we live in are not keepers of covenant. But Yahweh is always a keeper of covenant. Let's turn in our Bibles to Malachi chapter 2, verse 16. Let's see what the scriptures have to say concerning this subject. Malachi chapter 2, verse 16. For Yahweh, the God of Israel, said that he hates divorce, for one covereth violence with his garment, saying, the Lord of hosts. Therefore, take heed to your mind and deal not treacherously. Take heed to your mind. That's your spirit. He is comparing divorce here to violence. He hates violence. He hates divorce because divorce is violence to the covenant of marriage. So he says that he hates all of these things. He said, I hate divorce. If you love God, then you also should hate divorce. You should do everything within your power to keep it from happening. You should fight harder for marriage than you fought for your job or your career. If not, then you are not a man or woman after Yahweh's own heart, because Yahweh's heart is covenant. Yahweh hates divorce. If you hate Yahweh and love divorce, those two things will not go together. Why? Because marriage is the foundation of society. Its destruction is the destruction of society. The reason our society is falling apart, and it is because marriage is falling apart. Marriage is a covenant. It is the creation of Yahweh. Did you know that Yahweh created marriage? The coming together of one man and one woman. This was his original design for marriage in the very beginning. The reason being, he claimed this relationship and this institution as his creation. It was the same thing as the Sabbath day. They were created parenthetically, right there beside each other. Marriage was on the 6th day and Sabbath was on the 7th day. Yahweh is the creator of marriage, and he legitimizes it only through his church, through his ordained ministry, not the state, not the local courthouse, not the magistrate. They have no authority to marry anybody in the eyes of Yahweh. Of course, in the eyes of the state, yes, but in the eyes of Yahweh, that was not done by the church. I highly recommend that if you were married by the county magistrate or judge, I highly recommend for you to go find a true ordained minister of the gospel and have them remarry you in a private ceremony by the laying on of hands by the church of the living God. Why? Because Yahweh created the Sabbath. He created marriage, and these are his, and only he can authorize these. Marriage is an institution of the church. And before the early 1900s, the United States of America did not issue marriage license. Only the church issued marriage license because it is a sacrament of the church, not the state. That is why I don't care who marries 2 men or 2 women. They do not do it with the authority of Yahweh. It is fake news. It cannot happen because the church of the living God is the only institution authorized to marry anyone. Its design originally is Yahweh's pattern forever. However, if Yahweh created marriage and it belongs to him, then only Yahweh can come up with a way to dissolve marriage. Many believe a marriage cannot be dissolved. Why? Because the Bible tells us that the woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. If that is the case, and that is what the scripture means, then a marriage can never be dissolved until death. There are many in the Christian church that take that perspective. I once held that perspective. The issue of marriage and divorce has caused great distress to true believers around the world. The world doesn't care. Halfway Christians don't care. But true believers care about Yahweh's perspective on this subject. I want to talk to you about the balance today. You have 2 sides that, in my opinion, are extremely unbalanced. You have one side that says divorce is a sin because God hates it. And you have the other side that says marriage is a tryout to see if it works out for you. And if it doesn't, oh well. Both of these are out of balance. And the Bible says that the false balance is an abomination to Yahweh. He despises it. He loves the balance. You will always find the true God of Israel in the middle. You will find him a perfect balance of mercy and grace, law and works. You'll find it all. He loves balance. When it comes to this subject, he will bring you the true balance. But over here, you have conservative members of the church screaming, divorce is a sin. And if you get divorced, they won't use you in the ministry anymore. If you get divorced, you are pretty much a second-rate Christian. You're looked down upon, and the other side could care less one way or the other. Then you have this side of the church that says if you divorce, you must remain single all of your life or go back to your original wife or husband. They believe that if you divorce, there is never a chance, never to remarry. You simply must remain single. Then you have the other side over here that says divorce is no big deal. Whatever will be, will be. Que sera, sera. Then you go back to the other side. And you have the fundamental side of the church that says if you remarry after you divorce, you will be living in continual adultery. Where do they get that from? They get it from the Bible, from the words of Yeshua in Matthew chapter 5 when he said, if a man marries a woman who has a husband, they are both in adultery. You cannot deny that Yeshua said those words. You cannot deny it. He said those words. And before I came to the revelation that I'm going to teach you today, those words paralyzed me when I read it. Because there's no getting around them. They are there. But what do those words mean? That's the purpose of today's lessons. These are both perspectives that I believe are out of balance. Today, we are going to find the middle ground of truth. Truth normally lies between two extremes. I have found that to be the case. Why is this subject so important? Here's why. Church opinion has long favored the teaching that remarriage after divorce is adultery, based on what they believe to be a single mistranslated word in Matthew 5, verse 32. Let's turn there. I'm going to show you where this entire teaching that you can never remarry and you're living in adultery if you do comes from. It comes from a pretty important person, the head of our church, Yeshua the Messiah. Let's go there. Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife except for the cause of sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries her that is divorced commits adultery. Now, folks, that is in this case pretty black and white. In this pretty red, in this case pretty red, the red letters of Christ, it is pretty plain. Yeshua says if you put away your wife, you are going to cause her to commit adultery, and whoever marries her is committing adultery. If that is what he means, you can very easily see where the church gets that other side from. That is so strict and so dogmatic. What are the results of this teaching? A great many people today, perhaps yourself, are divorced and remarried, and you have suffered the shame of it in your local churches. While you had this perfect marriage, you were well thought of. You were high up in the echelon of the church. But the moment you went through the divorce, and God forbid your remarriage, you're not stupid. You felt the change, the way people looked at you. Those people all meant well. They thought they were obeying and honoring the words of Yeshua by shunning divorce and remarriage. So you can't blame their ignorance. When I say ignorance, I don't mean that in a bad way. Ignorance is a lack of understanding. Others are being refused leadership and positions in the church, such as pastors or elders, or a load of guilt is being piled on them for living in a constant adultery with their new partner, their new wife or new husband. It's very tragic. It's very sad. I've watched it. It is a heart-wrenching thing, and it's unnecessary. Many times it turns people away from God altogether, either in rebellion against what they feel is an injustice in the scripture, or else through discouragement over their own ability to remain single. They get lonely and they don't know what to do. They know if they remarry, they're committing sin, supposedly, so they just decide to stay single. And then they start living in sin. They don't know what to do because the teaching of divorce and remarriage has paralyzed an entire segment of Christian believers. I've watched it all my life. I want you to look at the image below, and I want you to look at the picture there. What you're going to see is Yahweh's goal. The idea of what every family should look like had sin and rebellion never entered into the picture. Amen. It's a multi-generational family of communities. Look at that. You see grandfather and grandmother, father and mother, and children, and a place to call home for those children. If your marriage choices are made with nothing less than this perfect picture in mind, then you've missed the point of marriage. Marriage is to create strong, healthy families. Children should never wonder where home is. They should never be put into a tug of war between mom and dad fighting over them. This is all from rebellion. Every bit of it. That picture is what the millennial reign will look like when all sin has left our planet and our rebellion has been quashed. This is what it will look like according to Matthew 24, verse 38, when he says there will never be divorce and remarriage, which is the meaning of marrying and giving in marriage. There will be no more divorce in the millennial kingdom. All families will look like this picture, but I'd like for you to look at the image below. This is the reality of the world that you and I live in. We don't live in a millennial. We don't live in the beginning. We live in the now. The second picture is the reality of our world. How does this happen? For the ideal marriage that I showed you in the previous picture, both parties, I want you to remember this. I have to stay faithful to the terms of the covenant. Marriage is a covenant between two parties, and it has to be agreed to. A marriage can never survive, no matter how much you love each other, no matter how good your intentions were when you gave your vows. A marriage cannot survive ever with only one covenant keeper. There must be two. Please never forget that. If you have endured divorce and suffered through remarriage, you've got to know something. The only way the covenant works is with two covenant keepers. Yahweh is so merciful and so loving and so kind. One of the basic principles about Yahweh, one of his characteristics that he stresses over any other, is his loving kindness. He said that his mercy is greater than his judgment. Yes, Yahweh hates divorce because he hates the breaking of covenant. But the beautiful thing about Yahweh is that what he hates is what he creates for his children as a way out of a horrible marriage. What Yahweh hates is divorce, and yet what I'm getting ready to teach you is that what Yahweh created was a legitimate divorce for his people. How can this be so? Because Yahweh has two wills. He has his perfect will and he has his permissive will. If we all walked according to his commandments, we would never need a divorce. We would be in his perfect will. But he is so loving and kind. He knew his children would mess up. He knew we would make horrible mistakes. Rather than giving them a death sentence, he gave them a punishment called divorce. And then he gave them a legitimate way to accomplish that divorce. Our study of the Bible today is going to begin with our search for balanced truth. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9 says, "This law is not made for a righteous man, but rather for the lawless and the disobedient. Here is the plain and simple fact. If you're a righteous man, you will not need any law whatsoever." Why? Because you'll love your neighbor as much as you love yourself, and you'll love the Lord your God with all your heart. You'll live a righteous, holy life. You'll treat your wife right. You'll get up and go to work and provide for her. Why? Because you made an agreement with her to do all those things. You're a righteous person. So therefore, Yahweh did not need to make a law for you because there is a law written in your heart. It's called the law of righteousness. But for every other person that's not walking in righteousness, a law had to be created because of the rebellion of men's hearts. If all men were perfect, there would be no need for a law, for the law would be written in all of our hearts. We would be totally incorruptible. Many of us married very young in life. I married at 19 years old, and we married before having these laws written in our hearts, before knowing the right ways of Yahweh. We married as animals in heat, still filled with human passion and selfishness. The purpose of marriage is to teach us the ways of Yahweh. It gives us an opportunity to learn how to forgive one another and love one another in spite of each other's weaknesses in sickness and in health. All of these are designed to create what was not in us to begin with in marriage. Marriage is a great experience and practicing for the millennial reign when we will love everyone. That is what marriage is designed to do in all of our lives. Do you remember David? He broke one of Yahweh's laws. It was called the law of the showbread. Yahweh's perfect will was that David would not eat the showbread because that was only for the tribe of Levi, which was the priest. Yahweh saw that David was hungry, and David went to the temple out in the wilderness, the tabernacle, and when he got there, he told them, "Give me the bread off the table of the Lord." They were scared to do that because it was against the law of Yahweh. It was not Yahweh's perfect will for David to do that, but Yahweh knew that David's situation needed a special circumvention of his law. David ate the bread off the table of the Lord against the perfect will of Yahweh. But because Yahweh is loving and kind, he did not kill David. He knew David was hungry. He knew that all of David's men were hungry, and their hunger was more important to Yahweh than Yahweh's own law. Yahweh made a provision for those that were not walking in his perfect will. So what is Yahweh supposed to do in a situation where partners refuses to honor the law of Yahweh? He refuses to honor the covenant of Yahweh. What is Yahweh supposed to do? Is he supposed to hold you to that marriage forever and tell you, too bad, so sad, so sorry to hear that, good luck with that in the future? The church would have you believe that if you marry someone and you find out the entire person you thought you married was an entirely different person, you had to stay married forever. Let's say that the man you married told you he was a millionaire, and he acted like it, showed you his money in the bank, said he could take care of you, and you come to find out he didn't have a dime to his name, and it was all a lie. You didn't marry a broke person. You married a lie. According to the church, good luck with that. Or let's say you married a man and one day he comes in and says, "Sweetheart, I'm sorry, but I'm attracted to men more than I'm attracted to women. I'll see you later." According to the church, good luck in the future. Sorry you married the wrong person. Or let's say he's a child molester. According to the church, so sorry, that's your husband until you die. I could go down the list. A man beats you night and day to a bloody pulp and you can't even see out of your own eyes anymore. You go talk to the preacher and he tells you to pray about it, that God will change him. There is nothing wrong with that. Don't misunderstand me. But they tell you to stay in that marriage, stay there forever, and then wish you good luck in the future. What kind of an answer is that for real lives? Real people who have to go on living. There is no answer. But where the church has failed to answer you, today we're going to hear the voice of Yahweh answer you from his own word. Yahweh is not going to hold you accountable for the failure of your partner to honor the marriage covenant. Yahweh's nature is just and it's fair. Tell me what is just and fair about a mother with a house of young children abandoned by a man who made a covenant to provide for her and leaves with all the children starving to death, forcing her to have to go marry somebody or live with somebody to have a place for her children. And you are going to tell that woman she is living in sin? You need a checkup from the neck up. The God we serve didn't want any of that to happen, but it did. Just like he didn't want David to eat the showbread off of the table, but he did. And the justice of Yahweh and the fairness of Yahweh always provides for a permissive will. I want to take you back to the beginning, since Jesus, which is Yahshua, talks about the beginning. And I want to show you the pattern that Yahweh set. Remember, Yahweh always follows a pattern. Before we can go back to the beginning, I want to talk to you about a book that really helped me in this study. I did not know about this book, but I came to find out that every police officer who has ever been to the police academy, every lawyer who has ever been to law school or studied the law in any form, shape, or fashion is familiar with this book. It's called The Law of Moses and the Code of Hammurabi. I got it off Amazon. You need to order it. It's a hard read. The print is small and it is very difficult to read. But I learned some things in this book that I did not quite comprehend before. Before Abraham was ever called out of the land of the Ur of the Chaldeans, there was a great society on planet Earth. We have records all the way back to the people of Shem, to the Semitic people. We have documents. We have things that show us how those societies lived. We seem to think of those days gone by that were way back as lawless days. But I was shocked to find out about the society-wide law that was in existence before Moses was told the law. The law was a worldwide law that is in existence even before Moses was told the laws of Yahweh. That was a worldwide law as far as there were people on the planet in those days. Before Yahweh gave Torah to Israel, there was a law given to mankind. Its origins are a bit mystical. If you study about the Code of Hammurabi, you will find out there are some statues that we have to this day that show that the Code of Hammurabi was given divinely to mankind, and it's shockingly close to the law called Torah. Now, there was a worldwide common law that generally governed the early world that all good people abided by. We're going to look first at the ancient Babylonian law, the Code of Hammurabi, and then compare it with Yahweh's law. Why would we do that? Who even cares about the Code of Hammurabi, Brother Vaughn, when we have the Torah from the Word of Yahweh? I'm in full agreement with you. My purpose is bringing out the Code of Hammurabi is, number one, you're going to see how divorce and marriage has been a concern for the most ancient of civilizations. And to think that Yahweh would not give an even better law to Israel than the Code of Hammurabi concerning this subject would be a mistake. Now listen very carefully. Your Bible without the Torah is so incomplete that it doesn't even have a foundation. The God of Israel never changes. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. To say that Yahshua came to earth and did away with the Torah, the law of Yahweh, his father, is so close to blasphemy. I can't think of how you can't get any closer. So for us to get an understanding of what Yahshua meant when he talked about divorce and remarriage, we've got to go back not only to Torah, but before the Torah, the Code of Hammurabi. And we're going to see when we do that, what the Torah corrected about this code. That was there when Abraham was born. If you look at the pictures above, you will see the Code of Hammurabi. We have them in museums today. This was the law written in stone. Hallelujah. There was one of these cylindrical stones in every city in Mesopotamia throughout Babylon, throughout all of the known world at that time. It was in the city center of what is called the gate of the city. You can find these codes of Hammurabi in all these cities, including the town that Abraham lived in, which was the land of Ur Chaldees. This law sat in the city center of the town of Abraham grew up in. He grew up knowing this particular law. It was not a perfect law. The Torah is a perfect law. This was the best they had concerning divorce and marriage. The Code of Hammurabi is a well-preserved Babylonian code of law of ancient Mesopotamia. It's dated to about 1754 BC. It is one of the oldest deciphered writings of significant length in the world. The sixth Babylonian king, Hammurabi, enacted this code. According to Hammurabi's code, a marriage was a simple contract. You may wonder why I'm focused on the law of Hammurabi, because if you are like I used to be, you are saying, I want to know what the Bible says. We're getting there, but let's lay this foundation of what a marriage always was from the days of Mesopotamia and even before. A marriage was always a contract. Always. If you don't get that in your mind, you're not going to understand marriage and divorce. Marriage was, is, and always will be a contract. It was so before Abraham was born, and it was only valid if it was written. You couldn't just say the vows, you had to write them. Today in Israel, they call that the ketubah, or the marriage contract. The marriage license is an assertion and an attestation, a sign that you have given these vows to one another. What is so amazing to me about the Code of Hammurabi is when you see how exact it is with our marriage ceremonies today. The marriage license and everything goes back to the Code of Hammurabi. It was only valid if it was written, sealed, and witnessed. How many of you have ever been married? You did what? You signed a contract. And then who else had to sign it? A witness. It all comes from the law of Hammurabi. This is amazing to me because when it comes to Yahweh's law, the 10 Commandments, what did he do? They always existed. The law of Yahweh was not created on Mount Sinai when they were given to Moses. They existed 450 years earlier because Yahweh told Abraham 450 years before Moses, he said, because you obeyed my law and kept my commandments, my ordinances. What laws? What commandments? What ordinances? The ones that always existed. But what Yahweh had to do in order to use those commandments to judge as a judgment was to write them down. The Apostle Paul says that he wrote them down that we might all be condemned. It is amazing. So this Code of Hammurabi was only valid when it was written and signed. That's why Yeshua had to come and seal the new covenant in his blood. His death was his signature. It is a beautiful thing. You can go to London right now and read the Code of Hammurabi on that stone. When you get to paragraph 128, you'll find out where these marriage laws originated from. In the Code of Hammurabi, divorce was allowed, but treated in different ways, depending on which party broke the contract. If the wife was guilty, her husband was able to divorce her with words. All he had to do is say, I put you away, and they were divorced. But he could never send her away empty-handed. In this book on page 120, paragraph 144 of the Hammurabi Code, this is the law written in that code. Stay with me. When you see the Code of Hammurabi, you're going to see what Torah did. Torah came in and corrected the injustice to the wife. This is what the Code of Hammurabi says. If the wife of a man who is living in his house has set her face to go out, to leave, and to act extravagantly, has wasted her house, one can bring her to justice. Why can we bring her to justice? Because all contracts can be brought to justice. If you break a contract, you can go and get justice. Marriage is a contract. Let's read on. And if her husband formally divorces her with the words, I repudiate her, she goes her own way and receives no azubu. If the husband does not pronounce this formula and takes another woman, then this woman must remain in the house as the new wife's servant. There were problems in the Code of Hammurabi that Torah corrected. Here was one of those problems. If that man puts the woman away and he will not divorce her by signing her the words, I divorce you, that causes that woman to never be able to remarry. She must stay in his home as a servant to his new wife. If she is at fault, let's say in those days a woman committed adultery or went out and wasted all the family money, breaking the contract. If the husband decided that he was not going to be her husband anymore and refused to divorce her, then she was his servant and the new wife's servant whenever he got a new wife. Let's look at some of the details of the divorce laws of ancient civilization. The wife had the right to divorce her husband if her husband had violated the marriage contract. However, this was very risky for the woman to do because if the courts found her to be guilty, she was thrown in the water and drowned. Where do we know that from? From paragraphs 142 and 143 of the Hammurabi Code. Therefore, very few women were willing to take their husbands to court for breaking the marriage contract. But when the husband was at fault, the law made sure that the wife was taken care of because of the following. The law was generous with her and took pains to provide for her support. If she had no children, her husband was to give her her dowry back as she left the house. In other words, in those days, the family gave a dowry to the husband, which was the bride price. If he was at fault and it was proven in court, then the family would get their money back, which was just and fair. The dowry was the portion of her father's wealth given to her when she married. Although she brought the dowry with her into her husband's house, it was tied to her for life and was never considered to be the property of her husband. In other words, a father would give his girl away and give her inheritance to her husband as a way to provide for the wife. But that was only his as long as he had the wife. So according to the Code of Hammurabi, if he puts her away and he is at fault, that money goes back to her. In those days, the law was just and the law was fair. This is so important. The wife was never intended to be the provider or the money earner. She never was intended to work. The dowry was for her to be taken care of. But if the husband broke the contract and divorced her, the money goes to her for support after the divorce. So she would have a way to get a home, provide for her children. So this has always been the law to protect the weaker members of society. In those days, the wife was the weaker member. She did not have a provision. So therefore, the husband was required by law to give her dowry back to take care of her. On the other hand, if the divorced wife had children and if the husband was the guilty party, it was handled differently. She received her dowry, of course, but in the place of the bride price, she was instead to have use of her husband's property. and food from his field or his garden. This served as alimony and child support in those days. If they had children together, not only did she get her bride price back, but she was able to use the house, get food from the garden, and grain from the fields. There were more rights that came to her if she had children. If you ever wondered where child support and alimony came from, it came from the Torah. It comes from this ancient law that very few of us know anything about. In those days, a tribe could come in and start a war and take the men as slaves. A strange thing happened here. This is very important because when you get into the New Testament, you're not going to understand something that Yahweh says if you don't understand what I'm about to tell you. So the husband would get captured and carried off as a slave for God knows how long. And here's his wife with all the children and no means of support. In those days, there were no food stamps. There was no Social Security. There was no American government. You were on your own. That was it. The wife, according to the Code of Hammurabi, was allowed to remarry because she had lost her support. However, according to the Code of Hammurabi, not the Torah, Yahweh is going to change this. If he returned from captivity, she had to go back to him even though she's remarried. Here's the worst part. When she went back to the first husband, she would leave any children from her second marriage with their father. That's in paragraph 133 of this code. This is very, very sad. And this is something Torah was going to correct. Because in the Torah, it is totally different. Why? Because Torah is the perfecting of this code that was already in existence. Sad situation. The man goes and returns home, and that's still his wife, although she had to remarry to be provided for. She goes back to her first husband, but she has to leave all her children with their father. Now, if a man deserted his wife, was not captured, but just abandoned her, she had the right to remarry, and if her former husband returned, then he had no claim on her. According to the church, that is her husband until he dies. But according to this code, no. You have no right to her if you abandon her and she remarries. According to Torah, you have no right to her if you abandon her. However, according to the modern day church, that is your wife forever, even if she remarries. Legally, in God's eyes, that's still your wife. You're going to correct all of that today. We're going to correct it all. You've got to stay with me. Read this to the very end so you can learn. Something else very interesting about the Code of Hammurabi is that the only prohibition against divorce was if your wife was sick. Let's say she was sick and she could not perform sexual relations. You could not divorce her according to this code, but you could take a handmaiden who could perform for you so that you could continue the family line. This is in paragraph 148 of the Code of Hammurabi. Now, that was a lengthy discussion of the code that might now seem important to you. I understand it's a little deep, but from here forward in this lesson, you are going to find a merciful God. Remember, we talked in the beginning about a balance and how Yahweh's main character trait is loving kindness and justice. You're going to find the injustice of this code that was in the whole of society. Every king, every nation abided by his code. But Yahweh is about to introduce to his people, not the rest of the world, not the rest of the people living by the Code of Hammurabi, to his people, Israel, with a man named Moses. He is going to step in and give a perfect law, a better law that comes from the mind of Yahweh into the hands of Moses. It's going to correct this law, and therein you find the purpose of the Torah, Yahweh's law. Torah pre-existed the code of Hammurabi. There's no doubt about it, but it had been forgotten. After the flood, Shem and his grandson Eber migrated to Canaan land and built the city of Jerusalem. Here, Shem appears under the title of Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. The book of Jasher calls him Adazedek, Lord of righteousness. In the book of Jasher, he is called the same thing. You may not be familiar with the book of Jasher. It's okay. It was in your Bible before it was tampered with. Let's read from Jasher, the chapter 16. Jasher, chapter 16, verse 11 and 2. Adazedek, king of Jerusalem, the same was Shem, went out with his men to meet Abram and his people with bread and wine, and they remained together in the valley of Melech. And Adazedek blessed Abraham, and Abram gave him a tenth from all that he had bought from the spoil of his enemies. For Adazedek was a priest before God. Shem, who was a descendant of Noah, knew the law of Yahweh. He knew Torah, the perfect law. He knew it well. He was taught it by Enoch, his grandfather. Methuselah, Noah, the title of Adazedek or Melchizedek was continued in Jerusalem or Salem, even after the line of Shem was overthrown by the Canaanites sometime prior to the Israelite invasion under Joshua. In Joshua's days, we read that the king of Jerusalem was still called Adonizedek. We know that from Joshua chapter 10, verse 1, though by now the rule was in the hand of Canaanite usurpers. Shem continued to obey and observe the laws of Yahweh and to rule the people by the Torah. After his death, the people and judges began changing and watering down the laws of Yahweh as taught to them by Noah's son, Shem. Shem apparently had some sort of educational facility or college to teach the Torah and the ways of Yahweh. The book of Jasher 24, verse 17 tells us that Isaac, son of Abraham, went there after his mother died. Let's read that verse. It's in Jasher 24, verse 17. And when the days of their mourning passed by, Abraham sent away his son Isaac, and he went to the house of Shem and Eber to learn the ways of Yahweh and his laws. And Abraham remained there 3 years. According to the book of Jasher, Isaac went to the school of Torah under Noah's son and grandson Shem and Eber, who had kept the Torah alive in Canaan land just after the flood. If that's the case, and according to the book of Jasher, it is the case, what happened to Torah? Both laws existed side by side during the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember, Isaac went to the school of Torah, but Shem has now died, and Eber has now died, and the law Torah is becoming a relic of the past. However, it still existed because remember what Yahweh told Abraham 450 years before the return of the Torah to Mount Sinai? Yahweh told Abraham, because you kept my laws, you kept my covenant. We never knew how Abraham had been keeping Torah when Torah didn't come to us until 450 years later. Here's your answer. Abraham knew the Torah because Isaac went to the school of Shem and Eber, and therefore Abraham was there with him for 3 years. So this is how he kept Torah. He knew Torah. Hallelujah. Now you might know why he was called a friend of Yahweh. Even though these laws existed side by side, one belonged to the righteous seed line, the Torah. The other law belonged to the carnal world. Torah belongs to the righteous seed line. This law, the Code of Hammurabi, is the law of the land. This was the common law of most of the world, including Canaan. During Israel's sojourn in Egypt, Yahweh's law was known by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but the children of Jacob literally forgot the law while they were in Egypt. It was already being forgotten during the days of Jacob. Isaac was probably the last one to be a great defender of Torah, but it was passed down in some form or another. Yahweh's laws was forgotten while they were living in Egypt. Now you might know why he told them immediately upon coming out of Egypt, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. How could they remember? Because their family had kept Sabbath. Their grandfather, Isaac, went to the school of Shem. Shem was a Sabbath keeper. Noah was a Sabbath keeper. If you'd like proof of that, there is a video on my YouTube channel that's entitled Noah, the Sabbath Keeper. You need to watch that because the law was forgotten. It was necessary for Yahweh to teach his people once again the law of Torah. They had it previously, but now it was going to be returned to them through Moses. Most of Pastor Shane Vaughn's videos can be found at hiscomingkingdom.com. Continuing on, we are about to come on a subject here that I think deserves your attention. It's often been said about Torah that it does not deal with enough. There are 613 laws, and surely there are more situations that we could all face than those 613 laws could provide for. So we ask the question, why didn't Yahweh give us more instruction? If Yahweh could have given decisions, lawful judgments, and ordinance of every situation that was to rise in the course of history, the law books could not contain and could not have been borne by the entire nation of Israel. If Yahweh had given a law so large as what was needed, they couldn't even carry all the law books needed in their journey through the wilderness. So we must realize, to some extent, rather than being an exhaustive, long code, the Torah gives the basic moral principles of life, especially in the 10 Commandments. And then it continues with 100 specific statutes to find the principles of the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments gives us the 10 principles. The Torah breaks those down and gives some legislative definition to their meaning. But it is imperative that we realize that often Yahweh merely corrects the errors of the Hammurabi Code in the Torah. They already had a common law that wasn't bad. It wasn't a horrible law. It just wasn't a perfect law. It had a lot of good things. We just read where the husband was to take care of the wife and give her alimony. That's all good stuff. So Torah doesn't have to talk about a lot of these things because they were known. Remember, what is understood need not be explained. There were things Yahweh did not have to deal with. It was already written down in the Code of Hammurabi. Please mark this down. Where there was nothing to correct, Yahweh did not elaborate, since custom already dictated that which was right. It is our job now to study the principles given to us and apply them to every situation that we face today, notably divorce and remarriage. This is the key to biblical understanding. Take the principles and find out how they apply to your situation that you are going through in your own particular life. We have discussed the Code of Hammurabi and some of the laws concerning marriage and divorce. And now you might understand why the Old Testament, the Torah, is not an exhaustive list. The reason is quite simple. They already had a good law, not a perfect law concerning marriage and divorce, but where it was imperfect, Torah will correct it. We must remember that Yahweh never changes. So this is important. The God of the Old Testament cannot say one thing about divorce and remarriage and then in the New Testament change and say something else. He just cannot do it. So, to understand divorce and remarriage, we make our mistakes in the beginning of the New Testament. We have to come back and look at Torah and then take Torah. Because Yahshua said that if any man thought he'd come back to take away the Torah, that man would be least in the kingdom of Yahweh. He said, I'm not going to change one jot or one tittle, but I'm going to expound it and explain what it means in your everyday life. A conditional contract or covenant is one that specifies conditions that both parties must fulfill. If one party breaks the contract, the wrong party may sue at law for damages or annulment of the contract. By definition, marriage contracts are conditional contracts. There is a lot of revelation right there. When you begin to see this, then the New Testament is going to make sense to you. It was always so in ancient times, beginning with the most ancient law going to the perfect law. Nothing changed in these laws. Contracts were conditional. In this respect, the Code of Hammurabi is in total agreement with the Torah, but the Torah and the Hammurabi Code specify contracts and their insolubility unless the contract is violated. Divorce, a complete break in the marriage contract, is lawful. It's not desirable. It's not perfect. It's just not perfect. But it is lawful in the eyes of Yahweh because virtually all marriage contracts involve vows made by how many parties? Two. If divorce is a sin, then your God, Yahweh, is a sinner. Do you think he will hold you to a higher standard than he himself cannot abide by? Hardly not. He's a wonderful God, a merciful God, a just God, and he loves you. He is sorry for the situation that life has brought to you. Many times consequences for your own choices. Many times it's not. Many times somebody didn't keep a contract. Yahweh, your God, is a divorced God. Let's take a look at his marriage and see what happened. In God's marriage to Israel at Mount Sinai, Israel, the bride, agreed in the contract to submit to his authority and to obey his laws. You can find that in Exodus chapter 19, verses 3 through 8. Yahweh, on the other hand, also entered into covenant. He agreed to give them the kingdom and the blessings of the birthright. This included honor, protection, provision, and children. That's Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. However, Israel, the wife, broke the contract. Remember, if the terms of the contract are broken, the contract no longer exists. Israel violated this contract, being incapable of obedience to her God. She refused to repent, and therefore her husband divorced her. First, he put her away and gave her a space to come to her senses. He gave her time to repent and come back. She refused. She abandoned him. She had the right to divorce her. He had the right to divorce her, and then he sent her out to his house. Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 8. And then he sent her out of his house. Right now, we're coming to the climatic point of this lesson. What is that point? The difference between two words. These two words change the entire subject of divorce and remarriage. Before Yahweh gave me this revelation, I didn't know the difference between these two words. We're going to talk about it right now. The two words are divorce and putting away. Word number one is divorce. The word number two is putting away. Here is a key to understanding the words of Yeshua and Paul in the New Testament. Putting away is not the same as divorce. Today, in our society, we call putting away separation. The words separation and divorce are completely different in the Torah. Notice Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 8. Let's read that so I can help you understand the difference between these two words. Without understanding, you will mess up the New Testament. In Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 8, and I saw, for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away. And these are two separate events now. First, I did what? He put her away. We separated. I gave her a notice. I gave her a chance. I put her away. We separated. And then to read on, I gave her a bill of divorce. Two separate things happened here. I put her away and I gave her a bill of divorce. Yahweh told her, get it together. She didn't get it together, so he did the next thing he allows for. He gave her a divorce. Here is my question to you. Is putting away the same as divorce? Absolutely not. This understanding is going to help us clear up the confusion from the words of Christ and the words of Paul in the New Testament. This is in accordance with the law of divorce and remarriage, as you can find in Deuteronomy chapter 24. In that chapter, Yahweh's Torah clears up some of the wrong injustices from the law of Hammurabi. Hosea chapter 2 verse 2 also says that Yahweh's divorce meant Israel was no longer Yahweh's wife. Let's turn there. Hosea chapter 2 verse 2. Plead with your mother, for she is not my wife. Now hold on. According to the modern day church and the words of Paul, a woman is a man's wife for as long as she lives. She's bound to her husband as long as he lives. So in other words, if a woman leaves her husband and even remarries, according to Paul, supposedly that is still his wife. Well, here is Yahweh saying something completely different. He says to tell Israel, to whom he was married at one time, you are not my wife. There comes a time when a wife is no longer the wife. When is that time? At the point of divorce. He says, neither am I her husband. They both are alive. Israel is alive. Yahweh is alive. And he says, I'm not your husband anymore, and you're not my wife anymore. How does that line up with Paul's teaching that says the woman is the man's wife until both of them are dead? No, because Yahweh never changes. You can't have it one way in the Old Testament and another way in the New Testament. It just doesn't work. Let her therefore put away her whoredoms out of my sight and her adulteries between her breasts. Yahweh divorce means Israel was no longer his wife. This disproves the doctrine called the eternal covenant of marriage. The Mormon Church teaches that, and many other groups believe that the marriage is indissoluble because from the beginning it was meant to be forever. I agree, but from the beginning there wasn't supposed to be murder either. But because we are not in the Garden of Eden, and because we are not in the millennial, Yahweh made provision for us just like he did for David with the table of showbread. Divorce is not a sin, but it can be called sin. What do I mean by that? Let me explain. Yahweh himself is a divorcee, so he can safely say that divorce itself is not a sin. It can be a sin, of course, so. If the one demanding a divorce does so with evil motives that are not in the law of Yahweh, The fact that Yahweh divorced Israel shows that lawful divorce is not the result of what? Sin. No, divorce is not sin, but it is the punishment for sin. That's how we started this lesson. The divorce was a punishment. Some of you were looking at me like, what do you mean divorce is a punishment for sin? Divorce is a punishment for sin. Somebody sinned. Somebody was selfish. Somebody had an evil heart. Somebody broke covenant. Therefore, the divorcee is the punishment for the sin or a violation of the contract. It is the final solution to the problem when all else fails. When reconciliation is impossible. Yahweh's laws on divorce and remarriage is plain. Let's read Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 through 4. Remember, this is the God who never changes. Yahshua did not change one dot of the law of Yahweh. Let's see what it says. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 5. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it comes to pass that she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some uncleanliness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it to her, and hand it to her, and send her out of his house. I want you to notice the phrase, write her a bill of divorcement. There's a huge difference here from the code of Hammurabi. Before the Torah came along and perfected it, all the man had to do was give a verbal divorce. All he had to do was say, I put you away, I divorce you. But Yahweh saw that was not perfect, so in Torah he says, no more of that. There is a flaw in the code of Hammurabi. My Torah is going to be perfect. So now, instead of verbal, Yahweh said, I want you to write down a bill of divorcement for her. Verse 2, and when she is departed out of the house, she may go and be another man's wife. I don't understand how we can read these two verses and see where Yahweh, number one, authorizes divorce and then authorizes remarriage, and see how we can have anything else to discuss about it. This is Torah. This is his law. The problem is we don't study Torah. We just study Jesus, the words of Jesus. Without an understanding of Torah, we murder the words of Jesus, as I'm going to prove in just a few moments. Verse 3. And if the next husband hates her, and writes her a bill of divorcement, and give it to her, and sendeth her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies, which took her to be his wife, her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. After that she is defiled, for that is abomination before the Lord, and thou shalt not cause the land to sin, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. When a man has taken a new wife, he shall not go out to war. He should not go out to war. Did you ever wonder why Yahweh ever put that in? He's correcting the law of Hammurabi. Remember in the code of Hammurabi, if a man was captured in war, the wife had to go find a new husband until he got back. Yahweh says, no, don't send the man with a new wife off to war. Neither shall he be charged with any business, but he shall be free at home 1 year, and shall cheer up his wife which he hath taken. The Torah is perfecting the code of Hammurabi. It goes on and on and on. I won't continue to read it, but you can. You'll see here that Torah is perfecting a law that was imperfect. Only if one sin is greater than all other sins can divorce not be forgiven. Remember that. Only if that's an unpardonable sin can it not be forgiven. Let me make this clear. There must be a biblical reason for divorce. And guess what the reason is? A false witness. When someone enters into a marriage and gives a false witness, they've broken the covenant. That is biblical. Let me give you an example. Let's say you marry a man and that man refuses to work. He refuses to provide for you and your children. You're living in the slums and getting ready to go live in a tent because he won't pay the light bill. According to the church, you are stuck in that situation, but he made a vow to provide for you. That's not providing. That's surviving. So according to Yahweh, that man is a covenant breaker. That's a biblical reason for a divorce. Some interpret verse 1 of chapter 24 that we just read to mean that he can only divorce her if she is unclean, meaning adultery or fornication, before he married her. But the sentence for adultery was death, not divorce. Thus, the grounds for divorce is the 24th chapter must mean something else. Since the grounds are not specified, it would appear that the common law needed no modification. Therefore, it is helpful to look at the Code of Hammurabi for a list of the grounds for divorce. Let's try and clarify that statement. It says in verse 1 that if he hates her and finds something in her he doesn't like, he can put her away. But the Torah doesn't really tell us what that means. We know it's not just fornication, and we have always thought because he could actually stone her for that, then he had to go to a law that was understood throughout the land as reasons for not favoring her. There are several things that the Code of Hammurabi states as reasons for divorce. Number 1, cruelty. Think about it. Let's say that your husband or your wife is cruel to you, crueler than to an animal, abusive beyond words. Do you know there is nowhere in the Torah or in the New Testament that allows you to divorce them for cruelty? And we have to wonder why. It's very simple. What's understood need not be explained. I repeat that like a broken record because in the days when Torah was given, it was understood in the common law as grounds for divorce. It's written in paragraph 184, cruelty. You can divorce cruelty. Another one was slander or waste of family assets. You marry a man and he takes all your money and leaves everybody in poverty and owes everybody in the country. According to the Code of Hammurabi, that was a reason for divorce. So when he came to the Torah doesn't correct that. What about running up needless debts, destroying the family, alcohol, drugs? The church would have you think you're stuck with all that. No, the Torah did not correct these grounds that are plainly written in the Code of Hammurabi. Therefore, what's understood need not be explained in Torah. Yahweh cared about the women's welfare more than the Code of Hammurabi did. Torah came along because the Code of Hammurabi does not protect the woman like it should, but Yahweh does. Let's read Exodus 21 verses 10 and 11. Actually, I'll first explain it. It tells you that the wife can divorce her husband for some offenses, but in addition to them, she can divorce him for lack of support. No food, no clothing. But what about sexual relationships? Let's talk about that. There is nothing in the Torah or the New Testament that says you have grounds for divorce if your husband or wife won't have sex with you. The reason being, that was common law. That was known. That's the purpose of marriage. What if they won't please you? Your physical needs. The church says the man can't get remarried. He has to stay with the woman without being satisfied. So therefore, he goes out and commits adultery. And that's okay with the church? Just don't divorce and remarry. It's a bunch of hogwash, isn't it? Let's read together. This is part of the Torah. Exodus chapter 21, verse 10 and 11. If he takes another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. And if he do not these three unto her, then shall she go out free without money. Did you hear that? If he doesn't provide her clothes, her raiment, and her sexual needs, do you see what the Torah says? Free to go. The primary difference between the Hammurabi Code and the Mosaic Code is that Yahweh takes an interest in the matters of the heart. Hence, even if the outward grounds for divorce appear to exist, there may well be hidden motives. Not only hidden motives, but sinful attitudes are against the spirit of Torah. Such things, in the eyes of Yahweh, would make that divorce unlawful. Let me explain. You can't just up and decide you don't want to be married anymore. You say, I have a right to divorce. In the eyes of Yahweh, it will never be right. You have some plain things that give you a reason, but you cannot cause your wife to commit adultery and then leave because she committed adultery. You're in violation of the spirit of Torah. Torah wants you to stay married. Jesus wants you to stay married forever. Your motives must be pure. Yahweh's law protects the woman. The divorce procedures differ in one very important area in the Torah. Whereas the Code of Hammurabi allows either the man or the woman to divorce the spouse with just a verbal agreement, Yahweh's law demands a written document, the bill of divorce. Hammurabi was careful to mandate that the marriage contract be written, but divorces were verbal. This was a horrible law. This was going to cause problems, and it did so. So Yahweh solved the problems by making the divorces written like the marriage contract. We will go to court to get a written divorce today. One can easily imagine a situation where a man divorces his wife verbally, but no one else heard the verbal divorce. And when she remarries someone else, here comes the first husband in a fit of jealousy saying, I never told you we were divorced. Now it's her word against his word. She is in adultery. Yahweh protects the woman by authorizing and commanding a written bill of divorce. Yahweh's law is just. It also protects the woman in this area. By this written bill of divorce, the wife can produce that to prove that her husband no longer has any claim on her. It is her security and her license to remarry. Therefore, Deuteronomy 24, verse 2, following on the heels of verse 1, states that once she has those divorce papers, she is free to remarry. This is from the God who never changes. How do we get into the New Testament and all of a sudden Yahweh forbids remarriage because her husband is still alive? This woman in Deuteronomy 24, verse 2, her husband was still alive. Yahweh says that's not your husband. The moment he gives you that writing, Israel, you're no longer my wife, and I'm no longer your husband because of this divorce. Divorce and remarriage was lawful. But if she were to remarry without those papers, according to Torah, she would be committing adultery. This is going to bring us to the words of Yeshua in Matthew chapter 5. It's going to all make sense. Hang tight. The truth is about to explode on you. Your eyes are going to come wide open. We've covered a lot of ground in part 1 of this lesson. Part 2 is waiting for you. When you get into part 2, everything that you have paid attention to in part 1 is going to cause the New Testament to fall out so plain before you, and you're going to just wonder, why did we ever see that before? I promise it is going to forever change your life. This is the end of part 1. Welcome back. This is part 2 of Remarriage Revisited. From the beginning, it was not so. Part 2, a fresh look at marriage, divorce, and remarriage. by Pastor Shane Vaughn, founder of First Harvest Ministries. Welcome back to part 2 of Divorce and Remarriage. If you didn't watch part 1, you're going to be very lost in part 2. Part 1 was chock full of what I call the foundation. When we get in the New Testament, as we're getting ready to do, and look at the words of Jesus, Yeshua, and Paul on the subject of divorce and remarriage, without an understanding of the Old Testament, you can never understand the New Testament. That is the fault of many churches today. We are focused on the New Testament, that the foundation that was laid in the Old Testament is completely discarded. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. We have a God that never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Let's begin in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 2. Just listen to what Yahweh says about divorce and remarriage. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 and 2 from the King James Version. When a man has taken a wife and married her, and it came to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, but because he hath found some uncleanliness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. Okay, according to what I grew up hearing in the church, God never recognized a second marriage. I believed that all my life until I studied the Old Testament. When I studied the Old Testament, I find a God that recognizes second marriages right there in Deuteronomy 24, verse 2. So does Yahweh change, or doesn't Yahweh change? Was he okay with divorce then, but he's not okay with it now? In the Old Testament, he didn't see the second marriage as adultery. But somehow in the New Testament he does. What is the answer to all of this? We started building the answer in part 1. If you've ever heard a preacher preach, it takes him a good 15 minutes to get the foundation laid before he gets to the good stuff. In this message, we are going to get to the good stuff. What did Yeshua mean? What did Paul mean? But let me recapitulate real quickly and tie up some of the loose ends from part 1 so you can at least regather your thoughts. Yahweh hates divorce. He despises divorce. Let's make that plain so no one misunderstands these teachings. But he doesn't hate divorce for divorce itself. He hates divorce for what it represents. Divorce is the evidence that the covenant was broken, that human beings did not keep their word to one another. For example, at the marriage altar, you both made vows to Yahweh and to one another to love one another. The husband made a vow to provide for the wife until he dies, but then she marries that man and he doesn't have a job and refuses to get a job. That leads that family to financial ruin. According to the modern day church, the woman is stuck with that man, although he broke the covenant and failed to live up to that promise. So this woman is forced into a situation where she must find a way to support her children. So she goes and gets a divorce so that she can remarry a man who will provide. Yahweh hated that divorce. Not because the woman had to get the divorce, but because the man broke his covenant to the woman to provide for her. That's why Yahweh hates divorce. It's the evidence of lies. And Yahweh is a God of truth. If Yahweh had his way, there would never be one divorce in this world. Now, Jesus, Yeshua, says, his original name was Yeshua, that from the beginning, it was not so for a man to divorce a woman. He is so right. But also from the beginning, there was to be no murder. There was to be nobody stealing from their neighbor. However, you and I don't live in that world of the beginning. The Garden of Eden. We live in the real world. This is imperative to understand. There is coming a day called the coming kingdom of Yahweh, when there will be no more murder, no more lying, and no more cheating. And guess what? No more marrying and then dissolving the marriage. Marrying or making a covenant and then breaking a covenant. There will be nothing but the purest love in the kingdom of Yahweh between a man and a woman. But today, that love is violated by the lies that are told at the altar. Yahweh knows that, and that's why Yeshua said he's allowed these things because of the hardness of your heart. Now, nothing has changed. We still live in a world where men break vows, where women break vows every day. So Yahweh is just and he's equitable. Yahweh is fair. Always remember that. You and I like cookie cutter answers. We like canned answers. It makes life so much simpler. We sort of like the teaching that says no divorce, no remarriage for any reason whatsoever. And we say, okay, that's easy. We can live with that. Who suffers because of that cookie cutter answer? Or how about this answer? You can only get remarried if your partner commits adultery. We love those cookie cutter answers. I've got one that there is no cookie cutter for. You marry a man and find out he's a child molester. Now he's not molested any children since you've been married, but you find out he molested a whole bunch before you got married. Where is the cookie cutter answer for that one? Or what if you marry a man or a woman and find out they've been running from the law for 30 years? Keep in mind that a marriage is a contract. The contract is only valid as long as the terms of the contract were honest and open from the beginning. Otherwise, you don't have a contract. We learned in the Old Testament from the Code of Hammurabi that there were flaws in the law of the land that Torah was created to correct. We just read in Deuteronomy that Yahweh allows for divorce and allows for remarriage in the Old Testament. We're going to pick up right there today and find out what the Torah was saying and how it applies to the words of Yeshua Messiah. In part 1 in the Code of Hammurabi, we showed you some of the flaws in that law. It was the law of the land that the whole world pretty much abided by, including Abraham. I want to go into that. I won't go into that today. Make sure you watch part 1. That code had a flaw in it. Here was the flaw. It said that a man and a woman could marry, and if they decided it just wasn't working, the man could put the wife away, or the wife could put the man away, simply by a verbal agreement to do so. They would simply say, today we divorced. We are ending this legal marriage. That was sufficient in the old world before Torah came along, but this presented a plethora of problems, as you can imagine. 3 weeks later, after the woman has left and found a new husband, the old husband has a memory lapse, or he doesn't like the fact that she's got a new fella, and walks over to the new fella's house and says, "You've got my wife," and brings them both down to get stoned at the city gate. This was a problem, but Yahweh corrected that problem in the Torah. He said in Deuteronomy 24 and read about it in many other places that there would have to be a written bill of divorcement in order for either party to remarry and it to be a legal marriage. Please keep that in mind throughout the duration of this part 2 today. The written divorce in the Torah. These men found a way around that requirement. As all humans, their heart was hard. So they would tell the woman, "I'm not going to live with you anymore. I don't like you anymore. I found a new filly and I'm going to meet her. Today, I put you away and you are out of my house." But they kept that wife on the ropes, so to speak, by refusing to give her the written divorce. So that woman goes and finds a man to help feed her and her children. What does that do to that woman? It puts her, according to Torah, in adultery. But the man in Torah, there is no penalty for him, although he caused the woman to commit adultery. He sort of gets off scot-free. Yeshua in the New Testament is going to set these men straight. They were so focused on the law of Yahweh, but they did not know the spirit of the law. Let me pause for a moment and say this. If you are confused by the law of Yahweh, we have a category for our videos on demand, and you can look at the category of the law of Yahweh. You can go to hiscomingkingdom.com. This teaching and so many others help you understand the layers of the laws by Yahweh. The difference that we want to talk about in this lesson today is that Yahweh's law, the Torah, protected the woman. She has to be given the written bill so she could marry again and get child support and alimony. But these hard-hearted Pharisees, these Sadducees that were so focused on the fact, I can give you a writing for divorce, but you're still my wife. But he could remarry, or he could go and move another girl in. This was all going to be corrected, and Yahweh put safeguards in his law for the woman. Why? Because he is fair, he is equitable, and he is just. Now, we are going to move into the New Testament. We are going to leave the Code of Hammurabi and the Torah and all of that Old Testament language, and we're going to move into those verses we have heard all our lives from Yeshua and Paul. But before we slip into the New Testament, we must make two things perfectly clear. The difference between two words. Until you get what I'm about to teach you, you will always be confused. And here you go. This is the big key. The two words. Divorced and putting away. You are familiar with those two ideas, but we don't call them the same thing in our modern language. We now call it divorce and separation. Separation is when you separate, but you don't divorce. The Bible refers to that separation as putting away. We must understand that in today's lesson, divorce and putting away come from two words. I want to reveal to you today the Hebrew word sholach means to send away or to drive away. In reference to a husband and a wife, it refers to the act of separation. The moment you had when you decided to give it a break for a while and you sent your wife away, or your wife sent you away, or you just both went away for a while. This is a time period when you are not divorced. You are simply put away. The term divorce in the Old Testament in the Hebrew comes from an entirely different word than the word for put away. Remember, put away is shock. Divorce comes from the Hebrew word karathath. This refers to a procedure. This is not the act of sending away. This is a procedure or a divorce when the marriage relationship is lawfully ended. Remember, Yahweh is a God of law and order. I know the New Testament church believes the law was done away with, but they are so wrong. They are just too wrong for me to even talk about right now. But you need to go watch our series, The Layers of the Law, at hiscomingkingdom.com. Okay, so karathath means the ceremony or the legal termination of the marriage covenant. This word is found 4 times in the Old Testament, and each time it is used with the phrase bill of divorcement. So when you see the phrase bill of divorcement in the Old Testament, it is the Hebrew word karathath. The scriptural references are in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, verse 3, Isaiah chapter 50, verse 1, and also in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 8. So you have Sholth and you have Keretheth in Hebrew. Two totally separate events. In the New Testament, we have the same events, but they are in Greek words there. Of course, here is the first of the two Greek words that differentiate separation and divorce. The Greek New Testament word for divorce is apostasian, apo, which is the root word, means away from. Stasis means established by law or standing by law, referring in this case to a written marriage contract. So apostasian means the law, apo means away from. In apostasian, you have moved away from stasis, the established law, by a legally binding contract. So apostasia is the Greek word for divorce. Keep that in mind. Yahweh's law, the Torah, states that a bill of divorcement or the keretheth must always accompany the act of separation or the act of putting away, the sholth. Without such a written document, the act of putting away does not constitute, in the eyes of Yahweh, a legal divorce. So, this is imperative to understand. A lawful marriage before the God of law and order has parameters. Separating without this written bill of divorce is not grounds for you to be free. You had to have a written bill of divorce. Now, we see that these two terms, shaloth and keretheth, are not synonymous, although by law they always go together, because you cannot divorce without putting away. You will see them together many times, but there are two totally different concepts. If the two words meant the same thing, then it would not make sense to talk about putting away and divorcement. When you read the Old Testament, you are going to find these two terms always separate: putting away and divorce, never together. As we read in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, when you read that it says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, there is your legal contract to marry. And for if she finds no favor, it says, let him give her a keretheth, a bill of divorcement. Place it in her hand and send her out of the house. You had to have a sending away and a legal document for that to be legal in Yahweh's eyes. Now, with those two understandings, when we get to the words of Yeshua, everything is going to make perfect sense to you. Why? Let's turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 31 and 32. You are going to get a shocker. You are going to get the words of the man Christ Jesus Yeshua HaMashiach, the Messiah. Guess what? It's going to sound like he's saying something totally opposite of what he is really saying. As I've been teaching you in part 1 and part 2. So let's read Matthew chapter 5, verse 31 and 32. It hath been said. Okay, he's referring to what? Torah. Or rather, the Jews' interpretation of the Torah, which is very carnal. Whoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. I just taught you that. Putting away an illegal writing of divorcement so she won't commit adultery. Verse 32, but I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication. I'm going to explain what an account of fornication means in just a moment. Causeth her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery. I'm sad to say that at one time I believed the teaching of that verse about divorce and remarriage, and I listened to a great man, a prophet, we thought, who taught if divorce and remarriage happened, only the man could remarry, not the woman, because Jesus said a woman would be committing adultery, but not him. What foolishness. We have believed all of our lives on this important subject. he said that he causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries her causes her to commit adultery. We always thought that meant that if a man divorces a woman and she remarries, she and the man who marries her are committing adultery. If you take those words the way it is written, without the misunderstanding I'm trying to give you, that is exactly what it says. But we know better, and today we are going to know better. There is a great dichotomy between the Old and the New Testament here, and interpreted by the King James translation. It would appear that Yeshua positively condemned divorce and remarriage. What did he say? If you put her away and she remarries, she is committing adultery, and so is the man who marries her. Now, if this is true, then this is showing Yahweh's law to be inferior to some divine moral standard. If what Yeshua is saying in the interpretation thereof, he is totally coming against his own Father's law. We're going to deal with that in a moment. However, I'm going to prove to you, starting with this second forward, that neither one is a sin before Yahweh. That's right. I'm going to prove it this very second. Always remember the words of Jesus were spoken in a certain context. The words in Matthew 5 were spoken during a very interesting sermon. We've got to look at the whole sermon. We cannot soundbite our doctrine. Soundbite is when you take that one verse and lift it up out of the whole of the chapter. When you take it out of the whole of the Sermon on the Mount, you can make it say whatever you want it to say. But when you go back to the beginning of his sermon, you find out that Yeshua is attempting to do. Then you will understand verse 31 and 32 correctly. For the most part, chapter 5 is a commentary on biblical law or Torah from Yeshua. Let's go to verse 17 of Matthew 5 and see if we can find what Yeshua is doing here. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Let's pause right there. I'm going to show you the ministry of Yeshua and what it was all about. Sadly, we have been taught that it was to do away with the law of Torah, which sets these marriage and divorce laws into place. But listen to what he said. Do not ever let it cross your mind that I came to do away with Torah or the prophets. I did not come to destroy that law, but I came to bring it to its fullest meaning. I came to establish it and to demonstrate to you the spirit behind the letter. This is so important that you understand this today. When a plane falls out of the air, what does it do? It literally fulfills the law of gravity or the law of density, whatever you prefer. When that plane comes down, it literally breaks the gravitational barrier and fulfills it. Demonstrates to you that the law of density or the law of gravity is. So, my question to you is, when the plane fulfilled the law of gravity, did it do away with the law of gravity? Poppycock. That's total tomfoolery. It's the sorcery of Satan to believe that. Yeshua came to do what that plane did. Demonstrate to you the meaning of the law of Yahweh in its perfection, in its perfect fulfillment. You need to watch my lessons on the layers of the law. There are 6 parts, and you will never again be confused by Torah and the words of Yeshua. Search for it on hiscomingkingdom.com. Now, let's continue in verse 18. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, not one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. When will heaven and earth pass away? Never. Until then, not one smallest detail shall ever pass away from the Torah until all be fulfilled. When is that going to happen? When is all going to be fulfilled? At that last great day, when Yahweh himself shall come to us and dwell with men, that in this culmination of all things, according to the Bible, that has not happened. The coming of Yeshua was not the fulfilling of all things, or we don't have to look for his second coming. If his first coming was the fulfillment. Let's continue. Verse 19. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. The subject is Torah. Those who break one of the least of these commandments of Torah and teach their congregations to break the Torah, they shall be punished by being called the least in the kingdom of Yahweh. But whosoever shall do the law of Yahweh and shall teach the law of Yahweh, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of Yahweh. Verse 20, for I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. He said, I know you don't think you've broken these little small parts of the law, but here is what he says to them. I am about to show you in my sermon to where you totally missed the spirit of the Torah. Yes, you got the letter right, but you missed the spirit of Torah. And he is going to show them regarding marriage and divorce, where they missed the spirit of what the Torah was attempting to correct in their own personal marriages and divorces. He says, your righteousness must exceed what you were previously doing by just keeping the letter of the law. Verse 21, ye have heard that it was said of them of old time, thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. He said, my commandment says, do not kill. But I say, don't even talk about your brother, because that was the intent from the beginning behind the letter of the law. You need to watch my series, Layers of the Law. He was destroying their mindset, not the law, not the Torah. He was destroying how they had twisted the Torah against the women concerning divorce and using it to their own self-gain. He said, you've heard, but I say again, it is not the law of the Torah that he is discrediting. It is their Jewish additions to Torah. Mishnah, the Talmud, the Tanakh, and the Takana. All these mystical additions from the sages or the scribes that have been added to it hurt the women while not touching the men. He said, you've heard that you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you, don't even desire another man's wife. He's raising the bar on the original intent of the law of Yahweh. So in chapter 5, that is what is happening here. Raising the bar. Remember that. In a nutshell, the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount was to improve on the law's interpretation, but more importantly, its application into our daily lives. What is part of our daily lives? Marriage, divorce, and remarriage. So he said, I'm going to show you what you thought you knew about Torah, and I'm going to show you the greater meaning behind it. Now, in verse 31 that we just read about marriage and divorce, Yeshua said, it has been said, whoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. There is a translation problem that we've got to go over real quickly. Let's read it again. Let's go back to verse 31, and I'm going to put on a slide, and we're going to look at the Greek words and the Hebrew words so that I can show you the error of this verse. We're getting to the good stuff now. Matthew chapter 5, verse 31. It had been said, whoever shall put away Apollo his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement, apostasyon. Notice the Greek word there is apollo. Then it says to let him give her aposion. I already told you that aposion means a divorce. But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away Apollo, his wife, saving her for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery. Now, in many translations of the Bible, he doesn't say put away right there. Look at your Bible and see what it says. Most Bibles say whosoever shall divorce his wife, and there is the error. The huge error is the word divorce. It's not supposed to be there. How do I know that? Because look below at the first line on verse 31. Notice that the phrase put away is correctly translated there. Apollo is not divorce. It's a separation. Put away. And then you see a totally separate word, apostios, for divorce, properly translated. But as you continue to read, but I say to you that whosoever shall divorce his wife, whoa, 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 whoa. We have a big problem, Houston. That's not the word for divorce. Apollo is the word for separation or putting away. Saving for the cause of fornication causes her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery. Another problem, Houston, big problem, huge problem, a problem that has tormented believers for centuries. Here's the problem. Whosoever shall marry her that is divorced is a wrong translation. Look at that Greek word. What is the Greek word? It's apollo. It is not the word apostion, which means divorce. It's the word for separation. It's the word for putting away. So let's read that with the intent of the Torah and with the Greek words correctly translated. Let's read that last line. And whosoever shall marry her that is separated. Oh, hallelujah. She is not legally divorced from her husband. She is living in a covenant with her husband, but she is separated from him. If a man marries a woman who does not have a legal divorce, then he has committed adultery. It's as simple as the nose on your face when you have a proper understanding. The Torah says that she commits adultery if she remarries without a written bill of divorcement. You can go back and read that in Deuteronomy. Yeshua said, but I say unto you that whosoever puts her away without giving her those divorce papers that the Torah demands, unlawfully puts her away, you will cause your wife to find another man without the divorce in her hands, and you will cause her to fall into sin. Here's what Yeshua is saying. Hey guys, you are all carnal minded. You took the Torah that said she had to have a bill of divorcement to remarry, and you thought you could mistreat her, physically abuse her, mentally abuse her, not provide for her, cheat on her, do anything you wanted to her, and if you got tired of her, you could send her away, and you don't have to give her that writing of divorcement if you don't want to. Yeshua said, you thought you were obeying Torah, but that was never the Father's intentions. The Father's intention was for you to give her the divorce so she would not be in adultery while you supposedly got off scot-free. If a man marries that woman that you put in that position, now he's an adulterer as well. Yeshua is telling them, boys, you've got it wrong. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Torah had not intended for you to hurt the women and send her away because you were tired of her, but you won't divorce her. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I know women in that situation right now, good women. their husbands won't give them a divorce, and therefore the husbands are holding a mental game over them. That man is in violation of the law of Yahweh. You can tell him I said so. No, you can tell him God said so. Now I want to say something regarding translation errors. Because I have so many people in our local congregation and all around the world that follow our ministry on hiscomingkingdom.com, YouTube, and our channels, that they always inbox me frustrated about these mistranslation errors. Let me say something. No translation of the Bible is inspired by Yahweh. None. Not the King James, not the Queen James, not the NIV, or whatever you've got. Not the book of Yahweh. Nothing is perfect in translations. Go back to the times when men translated the King James Bible. Those men did the best they could. They didn't quite have all the nuances of the Greek language and the Hebrew language. They did the best they could with what they had. They were not any smarter than we are today. And we still have translation errors. That's why it's incumbent upon you to study to show yourself approved unto Yahweh. Go back to the original words and simply look up their meanings, and you'll have a much better understanding. Don't be discouraged by translation errors. It's just a fact of the world we live in. The verse we just read in Matthew chapter 5, verse 31 actually endorsed divorce. Shock? Surprise? I know. I was too, because if you will go read that verse 31, it says, "Whosoever puts away his wife, let him give her a divorce." It's the New Testament. Words of Yeshua quoting the law of his Father that never changes. He said, I'm not going to change any of it. I'm coming to explain it. I'm coming to show you the beauty of it. And that's just what he did. For the woman's sake, he corrected the men's understanding of divorce and remarriage. Here comes a caveat or a fly in the ointment. When Yeshua said in verse 32 that whosoever shall put away his wife except for the cause of fornication, that caused a lot of confusion because most people interpret that to mean that the only way he can put away his wife is for fornication. That's impossible, too, because fornication occurs before marriage, not during marriage. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about fornication. The most common type of fornication in the Bible was prostitution. You can find that in Exodus chapter 22, verse 16. This is when a man has a sexual relationship with an unmarried woman. The solution to that problem was to get married. Exodus chapter 22, verses 16 and 17. Or stop and repent and never do it again. Those were the two options. However, the word also covers other forms of unlawful sexual unions. Just here on out in your mind, don't think of fornication as being marriage or after marriage. Think of it the way that the Bible describes it. An unlawful or outside of Torah sexual union. I'm going to give you more verses. For example, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 16 calls Esau a fornicator. Yet there is no record of scripture that he bought a prostitute. So how was he a fornicator? We read in Genesis 26, verse 34, the reason he was a fornicator is because he married strange wives outside of Israel. That's why Hebrews 12, verse 16 calls Esau a fornicator. Not because he was having premarital sex. No, he was marrying outside of the parameters of the law of Yahweh. May I give you an example of fornication during marriage? Here you go. When two men get married, according to the law of our land, they are married. According to the law of Torah, they are in fornication. Call it marriage. Call it whatever you want to call it. But it is an unlawful, not authorized by Torah, sexual union. Fornication is an unlawful sexual union. married or unmarried. I'll show you why. If you're married and you're not committing bestiality, the Bible talks about it. That's fornication. From this scripture, we read he went against Yahweh's command and married a Hittite woman. We find the term fornication used again in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1. It is reported commonly that there is fornication among you, and such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife. Thus, we see that Paul uses the term fornication here to describe another unlawful sexual relationship that was forbidden in Torah in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 7 and 8. Paul said that in the church there is fornication. Why? This boy is having sex with his stepmother. Guess what? The stepmother is married. The stepmother is involved in fornication, not adultery. Fornication. Adultery is when that married woman gets involved in another sexual relationship with someone else outside of marriage. In this case, it is unlawful. Therefore, it is fornication. In Jude chapter 7, we read about the people in Sodom and Gomorrah who had given themselves over to fornication, giving themselves to strange flesh. Unlawful. This is sexual sin. And yet the only thing we have on record of their sexual tendencies is homosexuality. Genesis 19, verses 4 through 8. Yes, they can get married all day, but according to Torah, it is unlawful. Therefore, it is fornication. These examples have one thing in common. They are unlawful sexual relationships. Therefore, there is no lawful marriage contract to bind it together in the eyes of Yahweh and his church. So Yahweh does not recognize that marriage in the first place. That is why Yeshua says in verse 31 that whosoever shall put away his wife, save for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery. In other words, if you're going to put away your wife, she's first got to be your lawful wife. And if she's your lawful wife, then you've got to give her a bill of divorce. But if you've been shacking up, hacking up, jacking up, and you're not married, that is fornication. You may call your live-in wife, you may call her your shack-up job or your old lady, but it's fornication. Why? There is not a covenant of marriage recognized by Torah and the church, not recognized in the eyes of Yahweh, and so therefore it's fornication. You can put her away without a bill of divorce if you're in fornication. But if it's not fornication, but a legal marriage, it will require a legal divorce to end it. That's what Yeshua meant when he said, save for the cause of fornication. In other words, if you're living together, you put her away, that's fornication. Yes, you can call her your wife all day long. That's why Joseph could have put Mary away privately. The marriage was not yet legal in the law of Torah. They had not yet made their vows, made their covenant, so he could have put her away without a divorce. The Bible said he sought to put her away privately. So if you're living in fornication, you don't need a divorce. And finally, brothers and sisters, we are ready to slide over now to the last pieces of this puzzle from the great Apostle Paul himself. We've gone all the way from the Garden of Eden to the Code of Hammurabi with Abraham to Moses' Torah. We've come to the words of Yeshua, and finally, we are coming to the most misunderstood words of the Apostle Paul. Hopefully, with the understanding you gleaned from the previous study, then you go into these writings, it will look different to you now with the understanding of putting away and divorce, and the Greek words that coincide with both concepts. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, And let's go visit Brother Paul in prison. I've often said if Paul only knew how his words had been twisted. The Apostle Paul warned us in his writings to be very careful with Paul's writings. You could read that in one of his epistles. Peter said, if you mishandle Paul's writings, you are going to destroy yourself. Same thing about marriage and divorce. Okay, let's read it. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Okay, so this is a commandment from heaven. Let not the wife depart from her husband. See, Brother Vaughn, case dismissed, end of the story, wrap it up. The woman is supposed to stay with her husband until death do her part, as long as he lives. She is bound to her husband. Don't let the wife depart. Let's go to verse 11. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried. Do you know what this has done to some of our good sisters in Yahweh's church over the years? I've watched it. It's heartbreaking. It almost happened to my own grandmother. Or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. Let her remain unmarried to be reconciled to that no count, no good, cheap, lazy, won't work, manipulating, whoever he is, whatever he did, she's either got to stay single, lonely, sex deprived, bored out of her mind with no income and no help, or she's got to go back to junior. And then it says, let not the husband put away his wife. Now, Paul, you are going against the Torah that said the man could put away his wife and the woman could put away her husband. You're going against Yeshua when he said that if you're going to put her away, give her a divorce. Here comes Paul, supposedly anti-divorce and anti-remarriage and anti-everything. But that is simply not the case. Let's look at this. And I'm going to put the correct words up on the screen for you. And unto the married, let not the wife depart. Chorizo. We're going back to verse 10. Look at the Greek word chorizo. There. I'm going to explain that word to you in a minute. Let her remain unmarried. Agamos. Notice the word agamos. Or let her be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away, ephemia, dismiss, his wife. Notice these words, for it's all mistranslated. You're going to see it in just a moment. Context is king. For this verse to make sense, guess what we've got to do? You're not going to believe what we've got to do. We've got to slide up the chapter to the beginning of the chapter to find what? To find the context. We teach our Bible students the context is king. So when we go to the verse, one of the same chapter, notice what Paul says. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Now hold tight. Why did Yahweh create a woman? For a man. Why? Because he was lonely. Now all of a sudden in the New Testament, men are no longer lonely. Men no longer need wives. Do you see how I can take that one verse and preach to you to remain celibate all your life? When Yahweh's word completely says the opposite. So what is Paul saying? That is the $1 million question. The subject of this discussion in chapter 7. Remember, Paul is responding to questions that he got in prison from the Corinthian church. That's all he's doing. He is now ready to correct some of the errors that have been made in response to this letter that he sent to them. Paul wrote to Paul in prison asking him whether or not to abstain from sexual relations and marriage itself. Evidently, Paul had previously taught them for a man not to touch a woman, but in the Corinthian church had misinterpreted. Imagine that. Paul's writings or his teachings previously to mean that sexual relations prevented Christians from obtaining a spiritual life. That's what the Catholic Church believes concerning their priest. Therefore, in the Corinthian church, the young people were being discouraged from getting married. And guess what else was happening because of the misinterpretation of Paul's previous teaching? Young couples were deciding to do what? Split up. After all, Paul tells them that it is good for a man not to look upon a woman. They love Paul and Yahweh, so they say, all right, I'll go back to Mama's house, and you can go back to Mama's house, and we will be right with Yahweh. This is the correction that Paul is making. It is true that Paul told them not to get married, not to touch a woman, but not because it was a sin or even a bad idea or a hindrance to someone's relationship with Yahweh. Rather, it was because of two things. Remember, context is king. Let's find those two things in verse 26 of the same chapter. Verse 26, I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. It is good for the current circumstances or the present distress. Now let's go to verse 32 through 36. Verse 32. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord. Now he may please the Lord, but he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. Verse 34. There is also a difference between a wife and an unmarried woman. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I speak for your own help, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that you may attend upon the Lord without distraction. Why does he speak this for their own help? Remember verse 26? Because of a current set of circumstances that the church found itself in. He said, I'm going to write these things to you only of your current situation. The tribulation and the horrible things we are going through as a church. Verse 35. And this I speak for your own help, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that you may attend upon the Lord without distraction. I don't want to make things hard for you, but that which is comely, that you may focus on the Lord without distraction. So let me make this as plain as I can to you. In those days, the church was being desecrated in ways you cannot imagine. Paul simply told them at this time, young men and young women, it might be better at this time for you not to get married until this passes. That way we can focus on spreading the gospel, and you young people can help me in the work. We can focus on the work. Remember, at that time, Paul thought Yeshua was coming back at any moment. He wasn't yet taught about the 2-day delay of the coming of the Lord. So he said, during this situation, it is good for you not to marry until we get past this. Just like if there was a famine in the land and nobody had food or groceries, I might say to you, why don't you wait until this passes before we start having children, making babies in this environment? Or during COVID-19, we might encourage you to hold on to that wedding for a year or until we get past this present distress. Now, it was an advantage to Paul to remain unmarried. It was an advantage for those traveling with him to remain unmarried. But his circumstances are not our circumstances. That's why context is king. Let's turn to verse 5 in chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians. I want to show you that here Paul makes it clear that it is not right for married couples to separate or even to abstain from normal sexual relationships. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer, and come together again. And Satan tempt you not, for your inconsistency. Here, Paul is telling people who are married not to separate. But here was a situation where they were in fact separating because of a previous teaching by Paul that was misunderstood. So now he is correcting it in verse 5. He says, if you are together now, don't separate. But if you're not married, you might want to hold off. But if you are married, don't separate. Don't depart from one another. Let's go to verse 7 through 8. For I would that all men were even as myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide, even as I. Paul is saying that it is good for them at this present time, because of our current circumstances, to abide as I am, single and alone. But remember, 2,000 years ago is not today. This has nothing to do with your current situation in life. Let's look at verse 9. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. In other words, Paul said, I am writing you a letter to correct the misunderstanding of what you thought I said. When I said that a man should not touch a woman, he said, I'm going to correct that because of the current distress. It's a good idea not to get married right now. Let's wait and let this pass before we bring children into that. But if you are already married, do not depart from one another. Do not put one another away right now. Do not leave your wife or your husband because what you thought I said. Regarding the same subject, Paul then turned his attention to the married couples, especially those couples that had already separated because of what they thought Paul said, thinking that was the scriptural thing to do. Paul's verdict is in verse 10, where he started in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10, and it reads, and unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. To the super spiritual married folks that wanted to go back to mama's house and serve the Lord, he said, I want to tell you something. I command you, as does the Lord, to not let the wife separate from her husband, and don't let the husband separate from the wife, because you're wanting to be super spiritual and misconstrue what I said. Verse 11, and let not the husband put away his wife. The problem in 1 Corinthians 7 was not divorce, it was separation. It is the key that you understand this. Now go to verse 11. This is something very important that I want you to remember from verse 11. These young couples separating were super spiritual, wanting to please the Lord, their hearts in the right place. The husband puts away the wife. He's not getting any. She's not getting any. Satan is tempting them both, and he stays at mama's house year after year and won't come back to her. She is needing a man and is wanting to get out of mama and daddy's house, so she might be tempted to remarry another man who is not trying to be super spiritual and wants to take care of his woman. So Paul has a warning for them in verse 11. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. This has nothing to do with your divorce and your remarriage. This is a totally different set of circumstances. So he tells the woman, now listen, you cannot get remarried if you are just put away or are separated. Notice the word agamos, and notice it with the proper translations. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried. Let me talk to you about agamos. I'm going to prove to you this has nothing to do with divorce. Agamos is unmarried. Agamos is a negative form. Anytime you add a in front of a word, it is the negative form of the word gamos. Gamos means the unmarried state or the act of not drawing up a marriage contract with someone. The way it is translated in the King James Version, it seems to mean, let her remain in the unmarried state. That's what it seems to say. But here is what it actually says. Let her not enter the marriage state again. Let her not get married to anyone else. Why? Because she is only put away. She does not have what the Torah requires, a bill of divorcement. If we would paraphrase this verse, we would do it in this manner. Let not the wife separate from her husband, thinking that she is pleasing God. But if she decides to, she should not get married to anyone else because she is still under contract with her original husband. Amen. Is this making any sense to you now? Making better sense? I sure hope so. Now, Paul is getting ready to deal with another verse we're going to now, with divorce and remarriage rather than just separation. So write in your notes, 1 Corinthians 7 has nothing to do with divorce and remarriage. You've got to understand that. That verse has to do with separation for spiritual purposes. Paul does not use the technical words for divorce and remarriage in the next verse that we are going to read. He uses descriptive words, bound and loose. Bound is marriage, loose is divorce. To be bound by a law means to be married by contract. To be loose means to lose from the contract, divorced or widowed. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 27 and 28. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. Circle that. Highlight that. Underline it. Whatever you have to do. Thou hast not sinned. You've not sinned. We're coming to the close. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. Don't be confused by the word virgin. It is a mistranslation. It has nothing to do with her sexual nature. It simply is a young girl, which we assume would be a virgin. She has not sinned. If a virgin marries, notice what he said. Are you bound by law? Not in fornication or shacked up or all of that? But have you done the right thing? Gone before the church and received the license of marriage from the church. Back then, the state was not involved in marriages, like they are never involved with baptisms. We have certificates for that, like we give a certificate for marriage. We used to do that in the church before the state took over that in the early 1940s. I bet you didn't know all of that. Amen. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. Are you loosed from a wife? Then don't seek a wife. But if you marry, you have not sinned. Here's what Paul said in the verses above. If you're married, do everything in your power to never seek a divorce. Keep your covenant. Raise your family. Live in the Spirit. Honor each other. Do the right thing. Both of you. Agree to the terms and abide by the terms. That's beautiful in the eyes of Yahweh. That's the ideal. It's not the reality of the world. That's going to be the kingdom life. Love and never divorce. Get with your minister. Do whatever it takes to stop divorce by any means necessary. And he said, and if you are divorced, seek not a wife. See, Brother Vaughn, the best thing for me if I get divorced is not to get remarried. You're missing the point. What is the point? Verse 26. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. Circle verse 26 because Paul is still giving instruction because of the present circumstances. I could take that verse and preach to my church that we should not be divorcing. We have preached that. We have kept women and men in fear of hell because of what we have preached. because we misunderstood these verses. So Paul is saying, don't seek a wife. But he is saying, don't seek one while we're living in this hell. Just hold on a little bit, brother. But if you do, you've not sinned. But because of the current circumstances, you're going to have trouble. I'm trying to spare you from things like them taking your wife to the Roman stadium and burn her in front of your eyes. I'm trying to spare you from that trouble. If a divorced man remarries, what did Paul say? The same thing that was in the Torah. You have not sinned. You need to honor life. You need to rejoice over that because some of you have been done wrong by the church. The church has held you in bondage. I have come to set you free with the voice of Elijah and the word of Yahweh, making the crooked paths straight, making the high places low, causing the word of Yahweh to make sense for you and to set you free from that fear that you have been placed under. Paul just told you in the verse we just read, verse 27, chapter 7, verse 27, that needs to be your victory verse. If you get remarried, you have not sinned. It is advisable. Is it advisable? Second and third marriages are harder, and if you've had children with previous spouses, my Lord. Paul said, I'm trying to spare you from the trouble, but if you do it, you have not sinned. Try to make it work. I hope this lesson helps you today. Remember this. Brother Vaughn, what about the scripture that says that a woman is bound to her husband as long as she lives? That scripture is 100% correct. But remember, when Yahweh divorced Israel, he told Israel, I'm not your husband. That's not your husband anymore, so you're no longer bound to him. As long as the bill of divorcement is placed in your hand, even though he's still alive, he's not your husband. He's just another man out there. He broke the contract. You've dissolved it. You are bound to your husband as long as he lives. But if he's not your husband by law anymore, you are free. I want to say this in closing. I personally have suffered the pain of divorce and remarriage. I struggled in my mind, tormented day and night for 5 years after my divorce, wondering if I could ever remarry. I pleaded with Yahweh for the answers in the Bible. I was willing to live single for the rest of my life, but Yahweh gave me the revelation about divorce and remarriage. I saw that my own grandmother, a godly woman whose husband had deserted her with 10 children, was told to remain single by the church that said that even if you starve to death, never get remarried. Yahweh is so much more fair than the church will ever be. This is the end of Remarriage Revisited. To know more of Pastor Shane Vaughn's teachings, go to hiscomingkingdom.com. Yahweh's blessings.